My
Good
name
morning.
is Jaime Catter, and I am presently in Martinez, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And today I am happy to present Father Ricardo Terga. He was born in New York, United States, in 1945 to parents originally from the former Spanish Antilles, that is, Cubans by birth and adoption. His house in his youth vibrated with the passion of the Cuban rumba and the fire of the Spanish copla. The origins of his grandparents date back to their beloved Spain on the paternal line from Asturias and Córdoba, and on the maternal line from Seville and Toledo. He was educated at a diocesan seminary in New York, entered the missionary order, the Congregation of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and earned a Master of Arts degree cum laude at Oblate College Seminary, and was advised to pursue a PhD in ecclesiastical history. Between 1972 and 1993, he carried out a mission in Guatemala, carrying out pastoral work among the Mayan, yes, Quechua Mayan, and Rabinal Achi Mayan populations of Alta Verapaz. He wrote several historical works, among them The Valley Bathed by the Rio de Plata, an ethnohistorical study of the people of the Motagua Valley, Alma Gemelas, a study of German insertion in the Verapazes and the consequent relationship between the Germans and the Quechua Mayan, and several books from the series The Harvest is Abundant. So again, I'm happy to present Father Ricardo Terga, and I originally came across him by way of a Guatemalan genealogical group, of which I'm also a member.
Ah, okay. So we should start?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And I feel very honored to be here with all of you. And the reality is you can ask all the questions you want concerning the work we've done throughout these years. When I went to Guatemala in 1972, I went to a town that was very impoverished in terms of material wealth, but not in terms of cultural richness. And by I was very enthralled with the Mayan culture, with the relationship between the Mayans and the Hispanics, which was kind of difficult in certain sense, but challenging as well. So I decided to write a history of the town. Now, when I wrote this history, I did it in conjunction with another person who was working in one of these government agencies to help the infrastructure of the country, of the town in particular. And we wrote it in 1976, and the book is entitled Tactic El Corazón del Mundo, Tactic the Heart of the World, because that's the way the Mayans describe their area of Guatemala, that particular town of Tactic, in their language, Kushakkal. Because of the fact that our people, the majority, couldn't even speak in Spanish, it obligated us missionaries, and me in particular, to learn the Mayan Pocomchi language. That's the majority language of those people. And to be able to read well in the Maya Quechua language. So I can speak well, thank God, in Maya Pocom and read very well in Maya Quechua. Well, this little book we wrote in 1976 was kind of somewhat well applauded and established among the people, but it wasn't much because our people were 90% illiterate. Then after that, I was able to work in another place called San Cristobal de la Paz. And I wrote also the history of that town. Now, there wasn't much documentation in terms of writing these books. Very few books ever written on them. No book was written on them. So this was kind of an adventure. and very innovative to a certain extent. But then what I did rely upon, aside from looking at the parish records, which were very illuminating in terms of the information of the families, I relied greatly on a few books I was able to obtain, but especially on oral tradition. I began to interview a lot of the people of the towns, these two towns of Tactic and San Cristobal. And on the basis of putting together um, a few books I was able to read, a few documents I was able to get, especially from the archives of Central America, information from the books of baptism and matrimony, and due to oral tradition, I was able to make a Hungarian goulash of all of this and begin to write these books. Because, as I said, nothing had ever been written on any of these books prior to my presence there. So after writing the one of Tactic and San Cristobal, I was very mesmerized by the fact that in the Rio Valley that you said there, the Rio de Motagua, I got to realize that the people who lived in this area were basically of Hispanic background, not of indigenous background of the people I was working with in Tactic and San Cristobal. So I was being of Spanish descent myself, I wanted to get to know these people better. And I wrote a small book entitled El Valle Bañado por el Río de Plata, the valley bathed by the Silver River, which is a small little book of this size. But it was very well accepted by the people and by the teachers of this area. And they used it in schools to be able to inculcate a greater knowledge of the origins of their families. Because let me tell you, nothing had ever been written about these people. That's one of the great tragedies of Guatemala. Aside from the western part of the country, where there has been a lot of investigation in terms of ethnology, anthropology, and even history, there are other regions of Guatemala where very little has been written. And especially these Spanish descended regions were very interesting for me because I thought they should know something about their history. So this was the first one I wrote, the valley bathed by the river of Plata. And many, like I say, many teachers and professionals really like this. Some of them said, this is our Bible of our area. Can you imagine? Because nothing had been written about them. So then,
Father,
yeah.
can you raise the book a little so we can see it
Oh, yeah,
better?
this is it right here. Yeah.
A,
Can you see it?
higher, please. Yeah. Oh,
Can you see it?
nice.
Oh, boy,
Yeah,
a little.
yeah. So then after this, I became aware of the fact, you know what, this region of Guatemala needs more knowledge of its own history and ethnology, because these works are basically ethnohistory, which of course includes families and tribes and all of these sort of things. So then I wrote another book entitled about that same region here. And this book is about Zacapa en el Progreso Colonial. Now, this book, I started to use a different method. I finally realized that in the archives of Central America in Guatemala City, they have a lot of documents. There, I started going to once a month to the archives there. Of course, being still a pastor of a Catholic church, I couldn't stay for many days. So I would go on a Monday, get there, and make photocopies of many documents. And during that period of time, the secretaries of the archives of Central America were very nice, very pleasant, and extremely helpful. So I was able to get a lot of documents. And when I would go back to my parish, there with leisure, I would study the documents. At the same time, I thought it was very important to be able to go to the parishes themselves in this region of Guatemala and study the marriage records and the baptismal records. Because, as you know so very well, during the Spanish period in which Spain was governing these countries, whether it's Guatemala, Puerto Rico, Mexico, wherever, they were very scrupulous in holding on to their documentation. Everybody was written in the baptisms. Everybody was written in the matrimony records. Everybody was annotated in the records of the deceased. So there's a richness of information and these books of matrimony, baptism, and deceased that is phenomenal. Of all the colonizing countries of the world, with Britain, France, Portugal, of course, as well, and Spain. It was the Spanish who were truly the most scrupulous in the whole idea of documenting everything. The Spanish kings were very concerned about what they was entitled to them since Queen Isabella in 1494, El Real Patronato, which means the royal patronage, in which the Pope of Rome gave to her, Queen Isabella, as the Queen of Castilla, who had financed the whole exploration of Christopher Columbus, to be responsible for the whole process of evangelization, of Christianization, of Catholicization of the Americas, of her realms. So after she died, it was Charles I of Spain, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and subsequent rulers were very, very scrupulous in fulfilling this obligation. And that's why we have so much documentation. The fact is that any event that took place in any part of the Spanish Empire, I hate to say Spanish Empire because really is known as the Spanish possessions of the Spanish monarchy, anything that took place, anything of any sort of importance, 3 documents had to be written. One for the local community, one for the capital of the region, and another one to be sent to Spain. And all those documents in Spain, of course, were housed in the archives of Seville. Unfortunately, because of the 19th century confusion in Latin America with civil wars and burnings of documents, oh my God, terrible. The documents that we have with great surety are no longer in great part in Latin America because of these civil wars that we've had. And then, of course, in Cuba and Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, these hurricanes, what the documents are mostly housed in Seville itself. So if you people have genealogy, Spanish genealogy, and if by any chance you have some sort of ancestor that had a position in the Spanish government of whatever country you come from, probably you will find information in the archives of Seville. I found a lot of information there in the genealogy I wrote of my father's family and my mother, especially my father's. So I was able to at least begin to get documents from the archives of Central America. And then in conjunction with that, I went to these different towns. I was able to go to these different towns. We would leave Monday morning at 3:00 in the morning with my secretaries. I had secretaries, thank God. We'd get to the place maybe at 10:00 in the morning. We'd had permission from the priest to look at the documentation, which is another advantage that I had. I thank God for that. The fact I was a missionary priest opened the doors for me to be able to study these documents. Otherwise, it would be very difficult because it is true many of the priests are kind of recalcitrant and don't trust many what we call lay people. That's a big problem. I understand that, and it's not good. But the fact I was a missionary, I could bring my secretaries and we'd study these documents, this information, probably until 12:00 at night. Oh, it was a real effort. Now I'm almost 80 years of age. I don't have the gumption to do anything like this. But then I was around 32, 33. We hardly eat anything, and we stay until probably 11:00 at night and come back to the parish because I had to be there for the masses. It was a real, when I look back, I said, my God, how did I do all this stuff? It's a miracle. So on the basis of that, I wrote this other book, Zacapa el Progreso, which of course you don't have to know what these things are, but it was based on books, very few books, unfortunately, and on documents from the archives of Central America, thank God, and also from the books of matrimony and baptism. That's how I was able to make what I call a Hungarian goulash of all of this and write these books. So that was from Zacapa. I did the same thing for this one for Jutiapa and Chiquimula. For this one of Chiquimula and Jutiapa, I was able to not only conjoin together documents from the archives and of course information from the church records of marriage and matrimony, but also interview people because I believe very much in the importance of oral tradition. Now, I had a big argument with, I gave some talks in Guatemala City in a university called Marroquin, and writing about the history of the local communities I worked in Alta Verapaz, in the northern part of Guatemala. There wasn't much information. So obviously I had to turn to somebody, and I turned to the local shamans. Shamans is, I don't like to say witch doctor. I'm very respectful about Mayan culture. I don't like that word, but to understand, well, let's say Mayan priests, like the Mayan priests. So I would interview these people and elderly persons as well, and conjoin together, once again, make a synthesis of the books I was able to read, especially the documentation from Central America, the marriage records and the baptismal records and the oral tradition. And I made this synthesis of all of this. This is how I was able to write this very big book on Taktik, the town I lived in for 16 years. This one here. I was able to interview quite a number of people, and like I say, I was able to write this. This now, what I put into these books, these latest books that I've written, this one, Carco, about San Cristobal, and this one of Coban, these three from the region I lived in Guatemala, I put in also the census records. If there's anything that I love, are census records. In other words, in Spanish, they call it Padrón de Pobladores. This is fascinating, whereby the secretaries, what happened once again, because the Spanish kings were so scrupulous in knowing who they were responsible for in catechizing, every 5 years, the Spanish missionaries, priests of all of Spanish America, from San Antonio, Texas, down to Chile and Argentina, had to make a census of their parishioners. And that was called Padrón de Pobladores. Aside from that, the governors of these regions had periodically had to do the same. If you can get that for local towns of where your ancestors are from, it is wonderful. Because in these Padrón de Pobladores, you have the name of the house, the owner of the house, the wife, the age of both, the children, and the name of the servants. Unfortunately, I hate to say this word, to slaves. It is a richness of information. So I would try to get as much as I could Padrón de Pobladores. So I put this in here for Taktik, the inhabitants of this town in 1803. I did the same for this one, also to the same date around 1820, because I believe that our Mayan people should know their genealogy. You know, they have a right to know their ancestors. So they only know up to the great grandparents. But in this information here, and in other works I've done for that I put in here, they can get to their 10th or 6th great grandparents. Because I believe very much that everybody has a right to access to their genealogy and to their ethnic history. So that's why these books are so voluminous, because inside them we have the listings of a lot of people. And also something I thought was very important to enrich these books, to take a lot of photos of old pictures, where they can see the principal personalities of the town of 200 years ago or 150 years ago, and be able to identify with this, because that's the whole point of these books in our region of Alta Verapaz, where the local population could identify with their history and with their culture and with their identity. So therefore, I continued with this whole process of going from one region to another. And then I decided, when I left Taktik, this town here, after 16 years, I went to another town called Coban, which is this one here. And when I started celebrating masses in the villages of the community I was in charge of, I started seeing these beautiful girls, Mayan girls, blonde hair, some of them, green, blue eyes, no shoes, no knowledge of reading and writing, poverty. I said, where do these people come from? And that's when I found out that in that region of Coban and further up to the northern part of our state of Alta Verapaz, the Germans had settled there beginning in 1864. And they started working there with regard to cultivation of coffee. Now I said to myself, look at these beautiful people in such dreadful conditions. I said, I'm going to write a book uh, explaining this whole reality and see how the German government could be somehow responsible to help these people who are and who have German extraction and background. It's quite remarkable. So, with that intention, I wrote this book, Almas Gemelas, which means in Spanish, twins, kindred spirits. This book has been very controversial because what happened is the most of the Germans who went to our area, you do have the wealthy Germans, the Germans of certain nobility. They came, bought up lands and all of that type of stuff, and they brought their wives with them. Okay, that's nice. But then they brought in German workers who were gardeners and who were whatever they little engineers. They didn't take a vow chastity like we priests do. We can't have wives, Catholic priests. So what happened is they intermingled with the Mayan women and had children with the Mayan women and fostered German in Mayan children. Unfortunately, in the majority of these cases, the Germans did not recognize their children in the courts of in the officially. So what you have is you have, for example, a boy by the name of Carlos Coy. Carlos Coy could be the son of Gustav Heinrich and Augusta Coy. She carries on the name. He carries on the name of the mother, but not of the father. So in the records, in terms of historical information, it's very difficult to know the origins of many of these people, unless you do interviews. So this book is based on, once again, on books, very little books, on historical records, and much as that's possible. On marriage records was very difficult, not much. It's especially based on 300 people that I interviewed. I interviewed 300 persons. It's on the basis of that that I was able to get information on the multiplicity of these children in the region of Coban, the Polochic, Caracha, Senau, and other areas of Alta Verapaz. So what happened is the following. Many of these children, some of these children of German, Quechua, or Mayan background didn't want to have the mother to be known. They only were important in the importance of the father, the German father. And some of these, of course, were descendants of landowners. So when I put there the name of the mommy, the mother, some of these people were not happy at all. And I was sometimes attacked on the phone. And at other times I was stopped in the streets. Why are you doing this? I said, because everybody has a right to know who their mother and father is. Everybody has a right to know what their ancestry is. So I got some flack from this. I don't care, because I believe these people have a right to have the names of their fathers also put in their genealogy. Do you understand what I'm saying? So what happened is this book has had a fantastic resonance in Guatemala, not just in our region and throughout the whole country. So now we're in the process of a fourth printing of this book. So I have to go to Guatemala, God willing, in it's already the third printing in February to have a fourth printing, because what enriches this book is also the photos. We have the photos of the German parents, but we also have the photos of the Mayan women, because I think it's very important to take into consideration the Mayan ladies. Oh, you understand what I'm saying? Another
Yeah.
thing, so this book has had a real resonance, this Almas Gemelas. And I think and of course, the people who are part Mayan and part German, and their names were never mentioned, they're very grateful about this. You have some resistance, like I just mentioned, but the majority are grateful. For example, I'll give you an example. There was a dear friend of mine. She no longer is my friend, as she passed away. May she rest in peace. She liked me very much in the beginning. She was the daughter of a Mayan woman and of a very wealthy German landowner, Irving Paul Dieseldorf, who came from Hamburg in Germany. He was a very wealthy man. And he had, of course, this lady, the cook, as a friend and had a child with her. And I won't give the last names because I want to preserve their identity anyway. And the daughter of this relationship was born and lived in very humble conditions. But when World War I broke out in in Europe, and of course the Americans entered that war, the American government was very stern about the fact that all those who were Germans in Guatemala, German nationals, and not Guatemalan nationals, shouldn't have their properties because the Americans were very anti-German at that moment, especially in World War II. So Irving Paul Dieseldorf, the father of this lady, was advised, Paul, Irving Paul, put all your farms under the name of your daughter, who was born in Guatemala, because she is Guatemalan. So he decided to recognize her publicly as his daughter, which he had not done previously. And therefore, she was recognized as the official daughter of this man. There was a tremendous party in the government building. She became the owner of these properties to be able to have him continue the properties. And when World War I finished, he became the owner once again of these properties. And she was educated in Germany. She spoke German perfectly. And then, of course, what happened was, being from Guatemala, she fell in love with a certain gentleman who was from Guatemala. But when the father found out, he said, absolutely not. You have to marry a German. And she ended up marrying a German. And of course, the children were 75% German and only 1/4% Mayan Kekchi. But when I wrote this book, and I mentioned her name and I mentioned the name of the mother, she was very angry at me. And that friendship collapsed. So sometimes when you do these type of things in very delicate circumstances, it's a little bit, you expose yourself to a little bit of controversy. But the general good is that many of these people who are grandchildren, great grandchildren of German parentage or ancestry can know their ancestors. You understand what I'm explaining to you? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So aside from some, I always got to see what is the origin of the Hispanics in Guatemala. I wrote all these books about the different regions and everything about the Mayans in our region, but I came to realize, how did this all begin? So I studied very seriously the genesis of the Spanish people ethnically of Guatemala. And I dedicated myself for 7 years to write about the Spanish community that started in Guatemala in 1524 in Guatemala City, because from Guatemala City, they expanded to the other regions that I just talked to you about. So I was able, thank God, I was able to get access to the books of matrimony and baptism of Guatemala City that are housed in the archives of the Archbishop of the cathedral in Guatemala City itself, because the town originally was called Antigua. It was built in 1541, but there was an earthquake in 1773. The town collapsed in many ways, and the location of the new capital of Guatemala went to where it is now in 1776. But all those books, the time it was in the Valle de Panchoy from 1541 to 1773, all those fabulous books, that richness of information was transferred to the archives of Guatemala, of the Archbishopric of Guatemala City. And I was favored by God, because it's only a favor by God, that I was able to talk to the Monsignor in charge of this archive. I told him what I was doing, and he said, "Okay, Father Ricardo, I'm going to do a great favor for you. You take, every time you come to the city, you take one book home, but don't you tell anybody that I'm lending you this book." And of course, that was because it was against the policy of the archdiocese to lend these books out. First of all, you have a problem even studying them, and what's even worse, taking them back to another place. But of course, I was very honest with him. I would study these books assiduously in my home parish, and then every time I go to Guatemala City, I would return that book, and he'd give me another book. Oh my God, what a richness of information! So, and then I had my secretaries. I must say, if I didn't have my secretaries, this could never have been done, because we would study the books, and then we would put the listings in alphabetical order of the people who lived in Guatemala City according to a space of 50 years. So from 1524 to 1561, 1561 to 1600, 1600, 1650, 1650 to 1700, 1700, 1750, 1750, 1800, then 1800, 1821. So this is the book. It's more than 1,100 pages. This is the book. I'm a little bit of a fanatic, as you can see. A little bit of, I admit that I'm a fanatic, 1,000%. So this is the book. And then I said, how am I going to have this published? I don't have the money to publish this thing because it's so much information. So I got in contact with the Mormons, Family Search of the Mormons, who are in Salt Lake City, Utah. And they found out about this, and they said, "Father Ricardo, could we have access to this and put it have it digitalized?" I said, "Fine, you can do that, but I like to have this book in book form, at least for myself." So they did that. They're the ones who had this put into book form based on all the work that we had done, and it's now digitalized worldwide, family search. So that's the work that I have been doing. Now, God willing, I'll be going back to Guatemala in February if everything goes all right. No, March. And then I want to write one other book on these three Mayan chieftains who were responsible for evangelizing our area in the 1500s. They won't be anything like this; it'll be smaller books. So that is the synthesis. I wrote another book on my family on my father's side, and I've done a lot of research and genealogy on my mother and my father's side. I attribute everything to God. I'm a very religious person, no monkey business. I really believe in God. So the thing is that it's wonderful. I go back to 850, 800, 1,200 years because of two prominent ancestors I have. Now, I say for all of you also, I don't think I'm the only one privileged to have two ancestors that are notable ancestors. I'm sure a lot of you also, without knowing it, may have a prominent ancestor who will, once you get a hold of that individual, he will be able to, you analyze his genealogy, will bring you back hundreds of years back. So I was able to be privileged. My Juan Ponce de Leon, he's my 14th great grandfather, the discoverer of Florida and first governor of Puerto Rico. He's my ancestor. And by way of him, oh my goodness, I could go back to the beginning of the 8th century. And there's another ancestor who is very prominent. And I'm not the only one. There's a whole host of people who have these people as their ancestor. The only thing, I don't work with Facebook and other than I'm a very primitive individual. I just work with archives, documents, and interviews and books, like I've told you. So another ancestor is Christopher Columbus, but that's not his real name. Christopher Columbus is not his real name. His real name is Salvador Fernández Sarco. You have to read this fantastic book. You have access to this. I'm sure a lot of you have ancestors of this nature without you knowing who they are. Portuguese Columbus. Columbus was actually born in Portugal, not in Genoa, Italy. And he was a man who was trying to hide his identity because, unfortunately, during that period of time in which he was wandering around the Iberian Peninsula, you have the establishment of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was established in Spain, in Castilla, because I notice I make a difference between Spain. I talk about the regions, about the kingdoms. It was established with our Queen Isabella, in 1480. Now, the reason why this was done, because without going into polemics, I'm sure we can go into all this stuff, is because she was a very devout. Well, I'm not trying to defend her. I'm trying to explain why she did this. She was not anti-Jewish, but she was extremely pro-Catholic. She wasn't against the person being Jewish. She was against the person not wanting to be Catholic, which is a difference. She wanted everybody in her kingdom to be Catholic. It didn't matter whether you were a gypsy or a Moor or a Jew or a Protestant. She wanted everybody to be Catholic because she thought that Catholicism was the only way to unify this extremely diverse kingdom as Castilla was. And she was also counseled by Jews who had converted to Catholicism. That's another interesting thing. So in 1480, she established the Inquisition. And of course, this got to Portugal. Now, the Portuguese have always been a lot more, how should I say, not that severe, that strict in this whole thing of religion. The Castilians have always been so much more severe in this. That's why they were able to convert so many areas. Anyway, but still, Christopher Columbus or Salvador Fernández, his mother was Jewish. His mother her name was Isabel González Sarco. That was the name of the mother. And when he presented himself to Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand to be able to be financing his voyage to the Americas, he obviously did not want them to know of his Jewish background. So therefore, he didn't reveal it. But when with this hocus pocus thing of Christopher Columbus, now it's been known for a fact that he didn't speak Italian. And it's also known for a fact that this Jewish identity of Columbus has been known for many decades, except nobody knows exactly the name of this woman, except on the basis of this historical, fantastic work done by these Portuguese historians. Now, it is an anecdote that is phenomenal that says his sons, Diego and Fernando, he had two children. Diego was the first son of let's say, Christopher Columbus, for the sake of the man we know. He was the son of, that was his wife was Felipa. And then, of course, she died. Felipa Pelestrello was her name. So the son was Colón Pelestrello. In reality, he was the son of Salvador Fernández Sarco. He always suspected, and with his brother Fernando, that there was a mystery in his identity. This is very interesting. And when the famous Christopher Columbus was dying, or Salvador Fernández Sarco was dying, the two children asked him, "Father, who are you really? Who are you really?" Because there were so many rumors about all of this. Who are you really? And as he died, he never told them. He never told them. He died with that secret. So it is fast. I'm presenting this thing to all of you because you're involved in genealogy. I'm convinced that many of us have ancestors that are very, very important historically. We just don't know who the heck they are. And by way of knowing them, your genealogy can go back decades, siglos, centuries. So that's what I have to present to you today. I know there's any questions. Any question? So
Yes.
I've done one last thing. So I've done a combination of books, archives, marriage records of all sorts, and interviews. It's by way of this methodology of combining these sources of information that I have been able to write these books on the certain regions of Guatemala, not just on books. You have to be innovative. You have to be creative. You have to go to the primary sources. And the primary sources of history, as you know so very well, so you're all involved in genealogy, are the marriage records, the baptismal records, right? And of course, any other document that's important concerning of your family. So many times books are nice and everything, but if you can get to the primary source, it's much better. However, I do admit, tragically, unfortunately, if you go to for example, you have a family that comes from Monterrey in California. The Spanish settled in Monterrey in the beginning of the middle of the 18th century. There was a very important Hispanic settlement in California, Monterrey. If you want to go to the marriage records of the parent, unfortunately, the priest may present you a lot of obstacle. That's a tragedy. But then you have another way out. You go to family search by way of the Mormon. I think they've been able to document, to photograph all these different records. They've done a fantastic. I mean, they've done a fantastic job worldwide. Now, in my diocese where I worked in the Verapaz, I'm very close friends with the bishop. And because the bishop knew I had worked with the Mormons to have this digitalized, he became friendly with them and allowed them to digitalize all the books and baptisms and records of the diocese, which is fantastic. Okay, have any questions before we conclude? I hope you've
Yes,
I hope you've understood everything I've been saying.
absolutely.
Yes.
Okay,
Absolutely.
thank you. Oh yeah.
So, Father, the first question is from Rita Vega Acevedo. She says, how does one explain the hatred, including the massacres of Guatemalan indigenous people by the military and complicity of Hispanic population? Have things improved?
Well, what is she talking about? Is she talking about the violence we had in the 1980s? Is that what she's
That
talking
was
Yes.
when President Rios Montt was
Okay,
there.
that's a very good question. Unfortunately, because I lived through all that period, I lived exactly through all that period from 1972 to 1993. I didn't get the gist of all the question, but it's because that's a very loaded question. That's a very interesting question. It has certain parts to it. Um, Unfortunately, tragically, and miserably, in Guatemala until recently, now things are getting better. There has been a real cleavage between what we call Ladinos, or Hispanics like ourselves, and the pure indigenous Mayan population. During the colonial period, during the colonial period, the Spanish authorities were very concerned about preserving the Mayan village, the Mayan towns. This is not known very well. So what the Spanish authorities did in conjunction with the priests, with the church, they are the ones who grouped together the different Mayans who lived in the mountains into towns. Because before the coming of the Spanish, the Mayans lived in the mountains, in the village, in the forests. The only thing they did would come down for the day of the market to the local temples and marketplace, and after buying their groceries or things, would go back to the mountains again. But to be able to evangelize these people and to be able to exact tribute from these people, the Spanish authorities, in conjunction with the Catholic Church, because everything was like this, it was conjoined together, church and state, they built towns. So all the towns that you have in Guatemala, colonial towns, were built to the colonial period by the help of the Mayan chieftains, in conjunction with the priests, missionaries, and following the prescriptions of the Spanish authorities. So the Mayan population during the colonial period mostly lived apart from the rest of the Spanish-speaking population. The Spanish-speaking population could live in valleys but they had to live two leguas. I don't know what leguas is in translation, in 2 leagues from the local Indianville town. So already during that period of time, there was a separation from the Mayans and from the local Hispanic population. It is true that during the colonial period, the farms that were being built in the southern part of the country by the coastal region, Mayan people would have to go down and work there periodically, what they call a system of repartimiento. But generally speaking, the Mayan population and the Hispanic population lived apart from each other. What happened was in 1821, and it continued 1824, the local elites, the colonial elites of Guatemala, as well as all Central America, without going into all these details, became independent from Spain and wanted to govern the country on their own. What happened was they were split into 2 different ideological parties. You had the conservatives, who were very Catholic, pro-Catholic, and were very they as long as they could get work from the Mayans, they had no problem with that, but left the Mayans in their semi-autonomous villages, towns. However, the liberals, people who had more liberal, open, so-called Enlightenment mentality, they wanted to integrate the Mayans into the national life of the country. So already you have this political controversy between these 2 groups among the Hispanics, and the indigenous population wants to live as they had during the colonial period, apart from the Hispanics. Are you following me?
Yes,
Then in 1871, you have a tremendous revolutionary change in the political life of Guatemala, with the coming of the liberal governments and presidents of Justo Regino Barrios, who decide to revolutionize completely the society, to throw out anything that was colonial, and also to expel all the priests, except the locally born priests in Guatemala. But his purpose was this: he wanted to destroy the Indian system of towns that the priests and the chieftains had built in the colonial period, and wanted to use the labor of the indigenous Mayan population as workers in the new farms that we built, coffee farms, cotton farms, cattle farms. They would become the laborers at the expense of owning their own communal lands. This was the tragedy that really began the suffering of the Mayan people. I'm not saying during the colonial period anything was hunky-dory. Of course, there were a lot of injustices, but at least you had the church in midst of its own situation trying to defend the local population, and you had the chieftains of each town to be able to have rights to defend themselves. Now, in 1871, with the coming of this liberal government under Justo Rufino Barrios, this will change completely. The church will be completely crippled with the expulsion of priests and religious and the confiscation of many church properties. And the indigenous towns, who are semi-autonomous during the colonial period, now also will be weakened, because no longer will they respect the title of colonial property. Every Indian family, every Mayan family will have a little parcel of land that they cannot live from. So obviously they have to have another way of surviving. So they have to work in these farms, coffee farms, whatever, at their physical and financial expense. So this creates a tremendous social problem for the indigenous population. At the same time, it cannot be denied, tragically, unfortunately, there has been a certain racism in Guatemala. It's kind of a delicate thing to talk about, but there has been a certain racism there. So you finally had this fantastic president, Arevalo. And this Arevalo was able to begin once again a social reform of the country. And of course, this was wonderful to a great extent. But then in 1960, you have the beginning of the guerrilla movement in Guatemala, but among the Latinos, among the Hispanics, not among the indigenous. But then in the 1970s, you have the beginning among the many Indian towns, Mayan towns, a movement to make them aware of their social economic situation. Because of that movement, many of the Mayan leaders opted to become members of the guerrilla movements. Opted to become members of guerrilla movements, thinking this was the best way to solve their social problems. So then you have in the 1970s, a lot of kidnappings and all sorts of terrible things going on. But then you have this President Rios Montt. Rios Montt was not a president, he was a general of the army. And he had said that everybody who was involved in this guerrilla movements should, and he was going to give them 3 months amnesty period to hand in their guns, their rifles, whatever it is, and to ask for amnesty. If they would not take advantage of this amnesty period of 3 months, he said it publicly on television everywhere, he would wipe them out. And he said any village that was considered to be cooperating with the guerrilla movement would expose themselves to annihilation. And then any other community that was cooperating was also exposing itself to a problem. So that's why the violence broke out in such a horrible way in 1981, 1982, with the killings of a lot of people.
That's
I think it's important to
But
mention
it has to be said that Rios Montt tactics were extremely brutal, but he crushed the guerrilla movement militarily. They continued surviving, but never as it was prior to his tactics.
I have another question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. I think it's important to mention that Rios Montt was not a Catholic. He was a fundamentalist Christian.
We have to be sincere about it. Originally, he was a devout Catholic, and his brother was a bishop who was totally against his posture. And then he became a renewed evangelical. Yeah. Very, very fervent. Yeah.
Okay,
It's
Father,
true what you're saying.
question. Are your books available for sale or are they online? Do you have like a bibliography of all the books you've done?
Well, because of the fact that I write these books and I sell them at I sell them at a price that's accessible to the people. So these books are sold very quickly. I don't have anything. The only thing that I will do once again that you could obviously find is this book online. Family Search, Ricardo Terga, and it's the history. This is fun, not because I wrote them, who am I, but because the information here is so interesting. I'll give you the title of the book. Wait 1 second. La mies es abundante. La mies es abundante. The harvest is plentiful. And it goes like this. España en la ciudad de Santiago de Guatemala. España en la ciudad de Santiago de Guatemala y la Nueva Guatemala de la Asunción Colonial. Y la Nueva Guatemala de la Asunción Colonial. And then you could, my name, Ricardo Terga Cintrón, and then you can find it on Family Search. And it's a lot of information. Unfortunately, however, this one here, Almas Gemelas, there is a third edition being made. I don't even have access to it. They do. I gave permission to the printing shop that did this for me. I said, Father Ricardo, can we make another printing of this book? And I said, sure, you make another printing. Just give me a copy because I'm not interested in money. They can make money out of it. So when I go to Guatemala in March, we're going to do a new one of this. And I'm going to see how this can be made more universal for everybody, including yourselves here, with more pictures, because I have a dear friend of mine who is a photographer, historical photographer, and he has hundreds of photos, many of which, of course, not hundreds, but we can put into this book to enrich it. Any other question?
Oh, question. Yes. Did the German government end up doing anything about the children in Guatemala?
Such a good question. I like that question. So the whole purpose was to see So many people on the basis of this book, in our region of German parentage, German ancestry, have, on the basis of this, have gone to the German consulate. And in some cases, they've been able to get German citizenship, EU citizenship, which I think is great. However, in certain cases, they are very demanding at the German consulate, this thing here in Guatemala City. They also try to demand some type of documentation. Some people have been able to achieve it, some have not. But I think we can say that some people have been able to get their citizenship by way of this. This has helped, and also documentation they have had with them. I do want to say an anecdote. I'm not in any way criticizing Germans, but it is kind of a funny situation. Because I talked to a lot of these descendants. I've talked to people who are descendant of a Mayan mother and a German father. And you'd think, because the Germans are notable for their, seriousness and all that, you'd think that the father was kind of rough. No, many times it was the mommy, the Quechua who was rough, the mom, the Indian, the Mayan mother. And I remember this particular incident, that this brother and sister, they wanted to get their citizenship from Germany because they're grandchildren of Germans and, of course, Mayans. So the light-skinned lady, listen to this is incredible. This is kind of funny, but kind of tragic. The light-skinned sister went to the embassy. Some of them are very light-skinned. And she presented what she had as documentation and everything, and they gave her German citizenship, EU. The brother comes, who whatever God will, he's much darker. He goes to the German consulate. And I heard, this is the anecdote that I heard. Maybe it's not true. The fellow in charge, you're not going to tell me you're German. You're not going to tell me you're German. I'm not going to wait for that. But then the fellow said, I have all my papers. I have all my papers here. Yeah, but then you're not German. You're not German, and you're not going to fool us. And they didn't give him anything. So sometimes a little bit tricky. But anyway, it's good to talk about this reality. And I still believe that it would be a blessing from God if some German institution or something could help these regions, these people.
Mm-hmm. One last question, Father. What was the name of Columbus's mother again?
Yes, this poor lady, Isabel Gonsalves, Gonsalves, Gonsalves is Portuguese. Gonsalves Sarco, Sarco. Isabel Gonsalves Sarco. And then the C is a Portuguese C that has a loop underneath it. Isabel Gonsalves, so you may be descended from her for all we know. I mean, you never know who we're descended from in these, and because the genealogy of all of us is so complex. Any other question? I'm here to answer any question you like.
I think we're good. Anything else, folks?
Anything else?
No.
How are your I have a question.
Yes.
How are your studies coming along in your genealogy? How far back do you people go?
Well, it's all over the map. I think some of us can go back to Spain very easily, and some of us just can't, because the paper trail starts to falter at a certain point. We can't make
now.
that.
Why would that be? Considering all I've told you, that the Spanish authorities and the church authority was so scrupulous and holding on to this documentation of marriages, baptisms. What happened? What went wrong?
Well, when you consider all of the Southwest and how the records were kept in different fashions, we know that a lot of the records went to Mexico City and to Seville, but
they all went to Spain.
Yeah, so there are going to be gaps, and we just have to battle our way piece by piece.
It's very difficult. Listen, if I go back that far, it took me 70 years. This was not done in 2 years. I started this when I was 10 years old because my parents would always talk about their parents. I mean, this is difficult stuff. It's not easy stuff. And remember, if you come from the Caribbean, these hurricanes did a real job on documentation. especially Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. It's terrible, terrible.
Yes.
Any other question that anybody would have? I know it's more than an hour now.
Can I ask a question?
Sure,
Yeah,
of course.
one last question.
Okay. Father, you mentioned to me in the past that we should say my 10th
Oh, yes,
grandfather
yes.
and
I
not
believe in that.
and
Yes,
not
yes.
my great great, you know.
Yes, that's a very good, because with regards to genealogy, to be able to really make it concrete in your own personal way, you should try to make it easy for yourself to identify your ancestors. So instead of saying my great 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 grandfather, that because after a while you lose how many greats. You can you should count how many greats. I start with my grandfather, great grandfather, so great grandfather. So he'd be number one. Great great grandfather is number two. Great 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 grandfather is number three. Great 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 grandfather is number four. And then it facilitates it to be able to identify more concretely and with greater ease who the ancestor is. Because, for example, what is it? It's Juan Ponce de Leon, my 14, what am I going to say? 14 greats? I mean, that's absurd. So you say 14th great grandfather. It's much easier. That facilitates your. Another thing that I think is very important when you study baptismal records and marriage records, you always should annotate the godparents. Always annotate the godparents, because usually by way of the godparents, it indicates an inkling of another relationship, maybe of another family to which they are related. Always annotate that. The godparents of baptism, confirmation, and matrimony in particular.
Great. We really thank you for your time and sharing all the great experience and good luck on your trip. And
Oh, I hope we can meet again. I hope we can talk once again. I'm here
yes,
to help. I'm here to help all of you in any way I can. So the thing is that when I come from Guatemala, I'll be back in May if I'm still alive for all this. We could have another get together to see how you can get access to almas gemelas,
ah,
kindred spirits. This is very important. So I'll see what I can do when I get to Guatemala, so you can have eventually access to this book.
great.
Okay, God bless all of you. It was great to see you. God bless
Thank
you.
you.
God bless you. Goodbye now. Good luck in your work.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Goodbye now, Jaime. Keep in
Bye-bye.
contact. Bye.